While I was hooked up to a heart monitor, my daughter-in-law sold my house. That was the sentence that kept repeating in my mind, steady and quiet, like the rhythm of the machine beside my bed, as if my own thoughts had synced with the soft beeping that filled the hospital room, and strangely, I didn't feel panic when I first realized it. I felt something colder, something clearer, the kind of clarity that only comes when there's nothing left to lose. Because 3 days earlier, I had been admitted for what the doctor called a minor cardiac episode, the kind they say sounds worse than it is, but still serious enough to keep a 68-year-old woman under observation for at least a week, and during that time, I had done what any mother would do. I trusted my family, I trusted my son Daniel to handle things at home, and I trusted his wife Ashley to help, the way she always insisted she did, with that careful smile and those gentle hands that never quite matched her eyes. And at first, everything seemed normal. She visited me twice a day, brought me clean clothes, adjusted my pillows, even spoke to the nurses with a kind of practiced concern that made her look like the perfect daughter-in-law. And I remember thinking, maybe I was wrong about her all these years, maybe I had been too cautious, too guarded, maybe she really did care. But then the call came, and it didn't come from Daniel, and it didn't come from Ashley, it came from a number I didn't recognize. And when I answered, the voice on the other end was polite, professional, almost cheerful. Mrs. Whitmore? I just wanted to confirm we're still on schedule for closing next Tuesday, and for a moment, I thought they had the wrong person, because I hadn't scheduled anything, I hadn't agreed to anything, and certainly not something that required a closing, but I didn't correct him right away. I just listened, because something in his tone told me this wasn't a mistake, and when I finally asked, closing for what? There was a brief pause, the kind that feels longer than it is, and then he said it. Simply, casually, like it was the most ordinary thing in the world, the sale of your property on Maple Ridge Drive, and I felt the room go quiet, not because the machine stopped, but because everything inside me did. Every assumption, every sense of safety I thought I still had, just stopped. And I didn't gasp, I didn't argue, I didn't tell him he was wrong, I just said, I see, and asked him to repeat the details, which he did, without hesitation, without suspicion, because to him, this was routine, just another transaction, just another house changing hands. And when I hung up, I placed the phone gently on the tray beside my bed and stared at the ceiling tiles, counting them the way I used to when I couldn't sleep. 1, 2, 3, 4, trying to keep my breathing steady, trying to understand how something like this could happen without me knowing. But deep down, I think I already knew the answer, or at least, I knew where to look, because Ashley had always been interested in things that weren't hers, not openly, not in a way you could point to and accuse, but in small, careful ways, questions about paperwork, casual comments about how complicated ownership could be, suggestions that I should simplify things now that I was getting older, and I had brushed it off, told myself she was just being practical, just trying to help. But now, lying there with wires attached to my chest and a stranger's voice still echoing in my ears, those moments didn't feel harmless anymore. They felt like steps, like a path she had been walking for a long time, and I had simply chosen not to see it. And the most unsettling part wasn't the sale itself, it was the fact that she believed she could do it, that she believed she had the right, or worse, that she believed I wouldn't be able to stop her. And that's when the cold clarity settled in completely, because I realized something she hadn't considered, something she couldn't have known. And I didn't reach for my phone to call her, I didn't press the nurse button, I didn't even sit up. I just lay there, listening to the steady beep of the monitor, and for the first time since I had been admitted, I felt calm, not the kind of calm that comes from comfort, but the kind that comes from understanding exactly what needs to be done. Because if Ashley thought selling my house while I was in a hospital bed was the end of the story, then she had missed the only detail that mattered, and I was going to let her keep thinking that, at least for a little while longer. I did not sleep that night, not because of the machines or the unfamiliar sounds of the hospital, but because my mind had already begun putting the pieces together, quietly, carefully, the way I had learned to do after a lifetime of managing things no one else even noticed. And the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that this was not something that had happened overnight. This was not a sudden decision or a misunderstanding. This was planned, layered, intentional, and the realization did not make me angry, it made me precise, because anger clouds judgment, but precision reveals truth, and I needed truth more than anything else. So the next morning, when Ashley walked into my room with her usual soft smile and a cup of coffee she knew I would not drink, I did not look at her the way I normally would. I did not search her face for warmth or reassurance. I simply observed. The way you observe something you already understand, and she moved around the room with practiced ease, adjusting the blanket, asking the nurse a few questions, updating me on small, meaningless details about the house as if everything were exactly as it should be, and for a moment, I wondered how long she had been rehearsing this version of herself, how many times she had practiced sounding concerned while doing something that required no concern at all, and when she finally sat down beside me and asked, "How are you feeling today?" I answered honestly, clear, and I watched the flicker in her eyes, just for a second, before she smiled again and nodded, as if that word meant nothing, but I knew it did, because clarity was the one thing she could not control, and I did not mention the phone call. I did not ask about the house. I did not even hint that anything was wrong. Instead, I asked her something else, something simple, something that sounded almost harmless. "Did you find those old documents I mentioned in the study?" And she paused, just slightly, before answering, "Yes, I think so. Why?" And I let a small breath out. Slow and measured, "I was just thinking about organizing things when I get home," and she nodded again. But this time her hands tightened just a little around her phone, and that was enough, because I did not need a confession, I needed confirmation, and I was getting it, piece by piece, without raising my voice or changing my tone. And later that afternoon, when she left, I reached for my own phone and made a call I had not made in years, not because I did not trust the person on the other end, but because I had never needed to, until now. And when he answered, his voice was exactly the same, steady, professional. "This is Michael Harris," and I said, "Michael, this is Margaret Whitmore," and there was a brief pause, followed by recognition. "Margaret, it has been a long time. How are you?" And I could have said many things in that moment, but instead, I chose the truth that mattered most. "I need to understand something about my house." And he did not ask unnecessary questions. He did not waste time with sympathy or small talk. He simply said, "All right, tell me what is happening," and I explained, carefully, without emotion, every detail I had, the phone call, the scheduled closing, the fact that I had not authorized anything, and when I finished, there was a silence on the line, not confusion, not doubt, but consideration, and then he said something that shifted everything, not dramatically, not loudly, but in the quiet, decisive way that real change often happens. "Margaret, your house is not something that can be sold without you, not legally." And I closed my eyes for a moment, letting those words settle, not as reassurance, but as confirmation of what I had already begun to suspect. "Explain," I said, and he did, slowly, clearly, reminding me of something my late husband had arranged years ago, something I had signed without fully understanding the implications at the time, because I trusted him, and because he had always handled those details, a structure, a protection, a layer that existed precisely for situations like this. And as Michael spoke, I could feel the pieces aligning in my mind, not just what Ashley had done, but what she had failed to do, the one detail she had overlooked, the one thing she could not bypass, no matter how carefully she planned. And when he finished, he asked, "Do you want me to intervene immediately?" And I opened my eyes, staring again at the ceiling tiles, the same ones I had counted the night before, but now they looked different, not because they had changed, but because I had. "No," I said quietly, "not yet," and he did not question that. He simply responded, "All right, but do not wait too long." And I assured him I would not, because this was not about stopping a transaction. Not yet. This was about understanding how far she was willing to go, how much she believed she could take, and whether Daniel knew, or if he was simply standing beside her the way he always had, without asking questions he should have been asking. And that evening, when Daniel finally came to visit, his expression was tired, distracted, the way it had been for months now, and he kissed my forehead, asked the usual questions, avoided eye contact just long enough to tell me everything I needed to know, and I did not confront him either. I simply watched, listened, and let the silence between us stretch just a little longer than it normally would, because silence has a way of revealing things words never can. And as he spoke about work, about schedules, about things that did not matter, I realized something else, something even more important than the documents or the legal structure or the closing date. I realized that whatever Ashley had planned, whatever she thought she had secured, she had built it on the assumption that I would remain exactly who I had always been in her mind, someone who trusted, someone who did not question, someone who would accept what was presented and move on quietly. And that assumption, more than anything else, was the mistake that would undo everything she had done, because I was still lying in that hospital bed, still connected to the same machines, still recovering from the same condition, but I was no longer the woman she thought she understood, and I was not going to rush, I was not going to react, I was going to wait, just long enough for her to believe she had already won. By the third day, the pattern became impossible to ignore, not because anyone said anything directly, but because everything around me started to feel just slightly off, like a room where all the furniture had been moved an inch to the left, subtle enough that most people would not notice, but obvious if you had lived there long enough, and I had, not just in that house on Maple Ridge Drive, but in the rhythm of my own family, in the way Daniel used to speak to me, in the way Ashley used to enter a room, and now both of those things had shifted in ways they probably thought were too small to matter, but to me, they mattered more than anything, because small changes are where the truth hides, and that morning, when Ashley arrived again, she was different, not in what she did, but in how quickly she did it. Her movements were efficient, almost rushed, as if she had somewhere else to be, something more important waiting just beyond the hospital walls, and when she checked her phone, she angled the screen away from me just a little more than usual, a habit she might not even have realized she had developed. But I noticed everything now, and when she mentioned that she might not be able to visit as often over the next few days because of some things going on with the house, I nodded as if that made perfect sense, as if I did not already know exactly what those things were, and I let her speak, because people reveal more when they believe they are in control of the conversation, and she spoke just enough, not too much, not too little, careful, always careful, but not careful enough. Because she made one mistake, one small detail that confirmed everything Michael had told me the day before. She mentioned a date, next Tuesday, and I felt the pieces lock into place with quiet precision, because that was the same date the man on the phone had given me, and it meant the timeline was real, the transaction was real, and whatever she had set in motion was already moving forward without hesitation, and still, I said nothing. I did not question her, I did not challenge her, I simply smiled faintly and said, "That sounds busy," and she smiled back, relieved, reassured, convinced that I remained exactly where she expected me to be, unaware, passive, irrelevant, and that was exactly where I needed her to think I was, because the moment she realized otherwise, the entire dynamic would change, and I was not ready for that yet, not until I understood every angle, every assumption she had made, every step she believed was secure, and later that afternoon, after she left, I called Michael again, not because I needed more information, but because I needed confirmation of something else, something that had been forming in my mind since our last conversation, and when he answered, I said, "If someone tried to sell the property without proper authority, what would happen to the buyer?" And he paused, just briefly, before responding, "If the buyer acted in good faith, they would likely be protected from loss, but the transaction itself could still be invalidated, especially if the seller did not have legal standing," and I nodded, even though he could not see me, because that was exactly what I needed to hear, not for myself, but for what it meant about Ashley's position. Because if she believed she was securing something permanent, something irreversible, she was wrong, and not just wrong, dangerously exposed, and I asked one more question, and if there were signatures involved that were obtained under questionable circumstances, and his answer was even more direct, then it becomes a much more serious issue, one that can carry significant legal consequences. And I let that sit in the silence between us before saying, "Thank you, Michael, I will be in touch." And when I ended the call, I felt something settle inside me, not relief, not satisfaction, but certainty, the kind of certainty that removes hesitation entirely, because at that point, there was no longer any doubt about what had been done or how it had been done. The only question left was when to act, and how, and that evening, when Daniel returned, I decided to test something, not directly. Not in a way that would force a reaction, but in a way that would reveal the truth without him even realizing it, and as we spoke, I said casually, "I was thinking about the house today," and I watched him closely, not his words, but the space between them, the fraction of a second before he responded, and there it was, that hesitation, that flicker of uncertainty that should not have existed if everything were as normal as he pretended it was, and he said, "What about it?" a little too quickly, a little too carefully. And I smiled slightly, the same calm, measured expression I had worn all day, just that I have not been home in a while, and he nodded, looking down for a moment before saying, "It is fine, Mom, do not worry about it," and that was all I needed, because reassurance, when it comes too quickly, is rarely about comfort, it is about control, and in that moment, I understood something I had not fully allowed myself to consider before, this was not just Ashley. This was not just her plan unfolding quietly while I lay in a hospital bed. This was something Daniel was at least aware of, if not actively part of, and the realization did not break me. It did not even surprise me as much as it should have, because distance had been growing between us for years, subtle at first, then more defined, shaped by conversations that never happened and questions that were never asked, and now it had reached a point where he could sit beside me, look me in the eye, and tell me not to worry about the very thing that had already been taken from me, and still, I did not confront him, because confrontation would give them a chance to adjust, to react, to protect themselves, and I was not ready to give them that advantage, not yet. Instead, I leaned back against the pillows, listening again to the steady rhythm of the heart monitor, and I let the silence stretch between us until it became uncomfortable. Until he shifted in his chair and glanced at the clock, and when he finally stood to leave, he said, "Get some rest, Mom," and I nodded, watching him walk out of the room, and as the door closed behind him, I allowed myself one small, quiet thought, not spoken, not shared, but held firmly in place. They both believed the same thing, that this was already over, that the house was already gone, that whatever they had done could not be undone, and that belief, more than anything else, was the foundation of everything they had built, and it was also the one thing that would cause it to collapse. The next morning, I asked the nurse to bring me a pen, not because I needed to write anything urgent, but because I needed something to hold, something to anchor my thoughts as they moved from quiet observation into deliberate action, and as I sat there with the thin hospital blanket pulled neatly over my lap, I began to replay everything from the past few months, not emotionally, not as memories tied to feelings, but as details, patterns, fragments of conversations that had once seemed insignificant and now revealed something much more intentional, because Ashley had never been careless, she had always been subtle, the kind of person who did not take what she wanted directly, but instead adjusted the environment around her until what she wanted simply became available, and I remembered the first time she had asked about the house in a way that felt slightly different, not just polite curiosity, but something more structured, more specific. She had asked about ownership, about how things were titled, about whether everything had been updated. After my husband passed, and at the time, I had answered simply, without hesitation, because I trusted the question, not the intention behind it, and that was the difference I understood now, because intention rarely announces itself, it hides in tone, in timing, in repetition, and she had repeated those questions in different forms over the months, always framed as concern, always presented as helpful, and I had allowed it, not because I was naive, but because I chose peace over suspicion, and now, sitting in that hospital bed, I realized that choice had given her exactly what she needed, access without resistance, information without scrutiny, and perhaps most importantly, the confidence to believe she could go further without being stopped, and I turned the pen slowly between my fingers, thinking about the documents Michael had mentioned, the trust my husband had established years ago, something he had insisted on handling himself, something he had told me would keep things simple in the future, and I had not questioned it then, because I trusted him completely, and now I understood that what he had really meant was not simplicity, but protection, not convenience, but control, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized how deliberate he had been, how carefully he had structured everything in a way that did not depend on anyone else's honesty or goodwill, including our own family, and that realization did not feel heavy or complicated, it felt precise, like a lock clicking into place after years of being quietly present, waiting for the moment it would be needed, and I looked down at my hands, older now than I sometimes allowed myself to acknowledge, but still steady, still capable, and I understood something else in that moment, something that had nothing to do with documents or legal structures, something much simpler and much more personal. I had spent years maintaining balance in this family, smoothing over tension, choosing silence when confrontation would have been easier, believing that time and patience would preserve what mattered, but what I was seeing now was not something that could be preserved, it was something that had already been replaced, quietly, gradually, without announcement, and the version of my family I had been protecting no longer existed in the way I believed it did, and accepting that did not bring anger, it brought clarity, the same kind of clarity I had felt when the man on the phone mentioned the closing date, the same kind that allowed me to remain still while everything around me shifted, and later that afternoon, when Ashley returned, she seemed more relaxed than she had been the day before, her movements slower, her tone lighter, as if something had already been secured, as if the outcome she wanted was no longer uncertain, and I watched her from across the room as she placed a small bag of toiletries on the side table and said, "I Brought a few things you might need when they discharge you, and I nodded, offering a quiet thank you, because I had learned that gratitude, when used carefully, can be more revealing than suspicion, and she smiled, sitting down in the chair beside my bed, crossing her legs with an ease that suggested she felt completely in control of the situation, and for a moment, we sat in silence, the kind that usually feels uncomfortable, but this time, it did not, because I was not waiting for her to say something. I was allowing her to decide what she wanted me to hear, and eventually, she spoke. The house is going to be easier to manage once everything is reorganized, and I tilted my head slightly, as if considering her words without fully understanding them. Reorganized? I asked gently, and she nodded, explaining in vague, careful terms about simplifying things, and making sure everything is taken care of properly, and I listened, not to the content of what she was saying, but to the confidence behind it, because confidence, when misplaced, is one of the most fragile things a person can have, and hers was built on the assumption that I would not question her, that I would accept whatever explanation she offered, and that assumption was still intact, still unchallenged, and that was exactly why I did not break it, not yet. Instead, I leaned back slightly and said, I am glad you are taking care of things, and the relief that passed across her face was subtle, but unmistakable, a brief release of tension she had been carrying without realizing it, and in that moment, I understood that she was not just acting, she was invested, emotionally, strategically, completely invested in the outcome she believed was already secured, and that made what came next even more important, because the more she believed in that outcome, the more unprepared she would be for anything that contradicted it, and as she continued speaking, filling the silence with explanations that sounded helpful but revealed nothing concrete, I allowed myself one final realization, one that settled quietly beneath everything else. This was no longer about the house alone. It was about understanding exactly how far someone was willing to go when they believed there would be no consequences, and once I understood that, I would know exactly when to act, not sooner, not later, but at the precise moment when the truth would not just be revealed, but undeniable. On the 5th day, they told me I would be discharged within 48 hours, and the moment the nurse said it, I saw something shift in Ashley's posture, not dramatically, not in a way anyone else in the room would have noticed, but I did, because it was the first time since all of this began that she looked alert, as if a timeline she had been quietly following had suddenly accelerated, and she smiled, of course she smiled, placing her hand lightly over mine and saying, "That is wonderful. You will be much more comfortable at home," and I nodded, returning the same calm expression I had worn all week, even though we both understood that the word home did not mean the same thing to each of us anymore, and I let the silence settle for just a moment before asking, "Will everything be ready when I get back?" And she answered too quickly, "Of course," followed by a brief explanation about some small changes and a few updates that would make things easier for me, and I listened carefully, not because I believed her, but because I wanted to hear how far she would take the story, how confidently she would build something that was already beginning to collapse beneath her, and later that afternoon, when she stepped out to take a call, I reached for my phone again and dialed Michael, and when he answered, I did not waste time with context. I simply said, "The closing is scheduled for Tuesday," and there was no surprise in his voice when he replied, "Then we need to be ready before that," and I could hear the quiet efficiency in his tone, the way he had already begun organizing the steps that would follow. But I stopped him before he could continue, "Not before," I said calmly, "at the closing," and there was a pause, not disagreement, but consideration, and then he said, "You want to let it proceed that far?" And I looked out the window beside my bed, watching the slow movement of cars in the hospital parking lot, each one following its own path, unaware of the others, and I answered, "Yes," because stopping something too early only prevents the mistake from fully revealing itself. And I needed it revealed completely, not partially, not in pieces, but in a way that could not be explained away or redirected, and Michael understood that. He always had. "All right," he said, "then we will be there," and I thanked him before ending the call, placing the phone back on the tray with the same careful precision I had used all week, because every movement now felt intentional, every decision aligned with something larger than the moment itself, and when Ashley returned, she seemed even more composed than before, her voice steady, her movements deliberate, as if she had just confirmed something important, and I wondered, briefly, who she had been speaking to, whether it was the buyer, the agent, or someone else entirely, but I did not ask, because I already knew enough, and asking would only serve her, not me, and instead, I shifted The conversation in a direction she would not expect. Do you remember when we first moved into that house? I asked softly, and she hesitated, just for a second, before nodding. A little, she said, though I knew she remembered very little of it, because she had not been there then. She had only entered that space years later, after it had already been filled with a lifetime of details she never truly understood. And I continued, not to share the memory, but to observe her reaction to it. Your father-in-law spent months making sure everything was exactly right, I said, and I saw it then, the smallest shift in her expression, not discomfort, not guilt, but something closer to impatience, as if the past itself was an inconvenience, something that had no relevance to the present she was trying to control, and that told me everything I needed to know, because when someone ignores the foundation of something, they inevitably misunderstand its structure, and that misunderstanding is where mistakes are made. And she smiled again, politely, waiting for me to finish, and I did, simply. Without emphasis, he was very particular about ownership, and she nodded, perhaps without fully processing the weight of that statement, perhaps believing it was just another reflection from an older woman thinking about things that no longer mattered, and in that moment, I understood just how complete her assumption was. She did not see me as part of the equation anymore, not in any meaningful way, not in a way that could influence what was about to happen. And that assumption was not just an advantage for me, it was the entire strategy, because the less she saw me, the more visible her actions became, and that evening, when Daniel came by again, his behavior had changed slightly as well, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me. He avoided certain topics, redirected others, and when I mentioned that I would be home soon, he said, "We will take care of everything," in the same tone Ashley had used earlier, and the repetition of that phrase, from both of them, confirmed something I had been considering since the beginning. This was not two separate perspectives aligning by coincidence. This was a shared narrative, one they had already agreed upon, one they believed was already in motion, and I nodded, offering no resistance, no indication that I saw through it, because the strength of any plan lies in the belief that it is unseen, and the moment that belief is broken, everything changes, and I was not ready for that change yet, not until the moment was right, not until every detail was in place. And as the room grew quieter and the evening settled in, I closed my eyes for a moment, not to rest, but to focus, to hold on to the one thing that mattered more than anything else, timing, because everything they had done had been built on a timeline they controlled, a sequence of events they believed would unfold exactly as planned, and what they had not considered, what they could not have known, was that the same timeline they were relying on was the one that would expose them completely, not before, not after, but at the exact moment they believed they were finally secure. The morning I was discharged, everything felt unusually quiet, not in the comforting way of a home waiting for its owner to return, but in the precise, controlled way of something that had already been rearranged before I even stepped back into it, and as the nurse handed me the final paperwork and Daniel stood beside me holding my coat, I watched him carefully, not for what he said, but for what he did not say, because silence, when repeated often enough, becomes its own kind of language, and his was filled with it, every movement efficient, every word measured, as if he were following a script he had already memorized. And when we walked out of the hospital together, the air outside felt sharper than I remembered, the kind of crispness that makes everything seem clearer than it actually is. And for a brief moment, I wondered if he would drive me straight home, if he would maintain the illusion just a little longer, but instead, he hesitated as we reached the car, opening the passenger door and saying, "We need to stop somewhere first," and I nodded, because I already knew, not the exact location, but the intention behind it, and I settled into the seat without asking questions, because questions would have forced him to respond, and I was not interested in his answers, not yet. I was interested in his choices, and the drive was quiet. The kind of quiet that stretches between two people who both understand something is happening but have agreed, without saying it, not to acknowledge it. And as we moved through familiar streets that slowly became less familiar, I watched the passing houses, each one a version of stability, of ownership, of something that belongs to someone, and I thought about how easily that sense of belonging can be manipulated when trust is involved, how something as solid as a home can be reduced to paperwork and signatures in the hands of someone who believes they have the right to control it. And eventually, Daniel turned into a parking lot I did recognize, not from memory, but from context, a low, modern building with large glass windows and a sign that read, "Real Estate and Title Services." And I felt the final piece of the timeline settle into place, not as a surprise, but as confirmation. And when he parked the car, he looked at me for a moment, as if trying to decide whether to explain something or continue pretending that everything was still unfolding naturally, and in the end, he chose neither. He simply said, "It will not take long," and I nodded, opening the door and stepping out slowly, deliberately, because there was no reason to rush, not when every second was leading exactly where it needed to go. And as we walked toward the entrance, I noticed Ashley standing just inside, already waiting, her posture composed, her expression carefully arranged into something that resembled reassurance, and when she saw me, she smiled, stepping forward with a warmth that felt practiced rather than genuine. "You are here," she said, as if this were a normal meeting, as if the circumstances surrounding it required no explanation, and I returned a small, polite smile, because in a way, she was right. I was here, exactly where she needed me to be, exactly where she believed she had full control, and that belief was the most important part of everything that was about to happen. And we moved inside together, the three of us, into a conference room where a man in a suit stood up to greet us, his expression professional, unaware of the undercurrent that filled the space. And as he introduced himself and began outlining the process, I listened, not to the details I already understood, but to the assumptions built into his words, because he spoke as if everything had already been verified, as if all necessary approvals had been secured, as if the person sitting at the table was exactly who the paperwork said she was, and in a sense, he was not wrong, because on the surface, everything had been arranged to appear that way. And Ashley sat across from me, her hands resting lightly on the table, her eyes occasionally meeting mine with a confidence that had grown stronger with each passing day, and Daniel remained quiet beside her, his role reduced to presence rather than participation, and I realized then that this moment, this exact moment, was what everything had been building toward, not the sale itself, not the transfer of ownership, but the belief that it had already happened, that it was already irreversible. And as the man began placing documents in front of us, explaining where signatures were needed and what each section represented, I did not reach for the pen. Immediately, I simply looked at the papers, taking in the details, the structure, the way everything had been organized to support a conclusion that had not yet been tested, and I could feel Ashley watching me, waiting for the moment I would comply, the moment I would confirm everything she believed to be true, and I let that moment stretch, just long enough for her confidence to settle completely, just long enough for the room to assume that nothing would disrupt what had already been set in motion, and then, slowly, I lifted my gaze from the documents and met her eyes, not with anger, not with accusation, but with the same calm clarity that had guided me from the very beginning, because this was not about confrontation, it was about precision, about allowing the truth to appear exactly where it could not be ignored, and in that silence, before a single word had been spoken, I understood something with absolute certainty. Everything they had done, every step they had taken, had led them directly to this moment, the moment where the one detail they had overlooked would no longer remain hidden, and when it surfaced, there would be no way to return to the version of events they had so carefully constructed. The room did not change, not immediately, everything remained exactly as it had been a moment before. The same polished table, the same neatly stacked documents, the same quiet hum of the building outside the glass walls, but something else shifted, something invisible yet undeniable, because the moment I lifted my eyes and chose not to reach for the pen, the entire structure they had built began to lose its balance, not in a dramatic way, not in a way that would alert anyone unfamiliar with the situation, but in a subtle, precise way that only those directly involved could feel, and Ashley felt it first. I saw it in the slight tightening of her fingers against the edge of the table, the way her posture adjusted just enough to suggest that something was not unfolding the way she expected, and the man across from us continued speaking, explaining the final steps of the process, unaware that the most important step had already been delayed, not by confusion, not by hesitation, but by intention. And I let him finish. I allowed the room to settle into the assumption that everything was proceeding normally, and only then did I speak, not loudly, not abruptly, but with a calm clarity that carried further than any raised voice could have. Before we continue, I would like to review the ownership structure of this property. And the man paused, his pen hovering slightly above the paper, his expression shifting from routine professionalism to mild curiosity, because that was not a question he typically heard at this stage, not from someone in my position, and Ashley responded before he could, her voice smooth, controlled. "Everything has already been verified," she said, and I turned my head slightly toward her, not with confrontation, but with quiet acknowledgement. "I am sure it has," I replied, "but I would still like to hear it explained." And there was a brief silence, the kind that forms when certainty meets an unexpected request, and the man nodded, adjusting his papers, flipping through the documents until he reached the section that outlined the legal framework of the property, and as he began to speak, outlining the chain of title, the transfer documents, and the authorization that had been presented, I listened carefully, not because I needed the information, but because I wanted to hear how it was being interpreted, how it had been framed to support a conclusion that had never actually been secured, and when he finished, I waited a moment before asking the one question that mattered, the one question that would bring everything into focus, and the trust? I said, simply, and for the first time since we had entered the room. There was a pause that did not resolve itself immediately. The man looked down at the documents again, his brow tightening slightly as he searched for something that had not been included in the summary he had just given, and Ashley's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough. Her confidence did not disappear, but it shifted, became more focused, more alert, as if she were recalculating something she had assumed was already accounted for, and Daniel, sitting beside her, went completely still, his silence no longer passive, but attentive, as if he were beginning to understand that something was happening that he had not fully anticipated, and I remained exactly as I had been, calm, composed, allowing the moment to unfold without forcing it forward, because this was not about revealing information, it was about allowing the absence of that information to become visible, and the man cleared his throat slightly, flipping through the pages again. I do not see a trust referenced here, he said, carefully, and I nodded, not in disagreement, but in confirmation. That is because it would not be included in those documents, I replied, my voice steady, measured. It exists separately, and it governs the ownership of the property in a way that supersedes any individual authorization, and the room grew quieter, not because of anything dramatic, but because the assumptions that had been holding everything together were beginning to shift, and Ashley leaned forward slightly, her tone still controlled, but with a new edge beneath it. We have all the necessary signatures, she said, and I looked at her, meeting her gaze fully for the first time since we sat down. Signatures are not the same as authority, I answered, and that was the moment, the exact moment when everything changed, not outwardly, not in a way that would draw attention from outside the room, but internally. Structurally, because the narrative she had built, the one she had relied on, the one she believed was already complete, now had a gap in it, a gap she had not accounted for, and gaps, once exposed, do not close easily, and the man shifted in his seat, his attention now fully engaged, no longer following a routine process, but actively reassessing the situation. If there is a trust involved, we would need to review it before proceeding, he said, and I nodded. Of course, I replied, reaching calmly into my bag and removing a folder I had prepared before leaving the hospital, placing it gently on the table, not with force, not with emphasis, but with the quiet certainty of something that had always belonged there, and as I opened it, I could feel the shift in the room deepen, not because of what I was doing, but because of what it represented, the one detail they had overlooked, the one element they had assumed did not matter, now sitting directly in front of them, undeniable, and as the man reached for the documents, beginning to review them with a level of attention that had not been present before, I leaned back slightly, allowing the process to continue without interference, because the truth, once introduced, does not need to be forced, it reveals itself naturally, and I watched as his expression changed, not dramatically, but gradually, as understanding replaced assumption, and in that moment, I did not feel anger, I did not feel satisfaction, I felt something much simpler, something much clearer. I felt alignment, because everything that had been set in motion, every decision I had made, every moment I had chosen to remain silent, had led exactly here, to a point where nothing needed to be explained, nothing needed to be argued. Everything simply was. The change in the room was no longer subtle, it had moved beyond the quiet shifts and unspoken assumptions into something far more concrete, something that could be seen in the way the man across from us adjusted his posture, in the way his tone lost its rehearsed smoothness and became more deliberate, more cautious, because the documents in his hands were no longer supporting a routine transaction, they were challenging it, and as he read through the trust agreement, page by page, I watched. Not just him, but Ashley, because this was the moment where belief meets reality, where confidence either holds or begins to fracture, and I saw it happen slowly, not in a dramatic collapse, but in the smallest details, the way her shoulders stiffened, the way her gaze shifted from me to the documents and back again, as if trying to understand how something she had not accounted for could suddenly become the center of everything, and Daniel remained still beside her, but his stillness was different now, no longer passive, no longer neutral, it carried weight, the kind of weight that comes when someone realizes they are part of something they do not fully understand. And the man finally set the papers down, his expression no longer neutral, no longer procedural, but focused. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said carefully. "According to this trust, the property is not held under direct personal ownership. It is controlled by the trust itself, with you as the sole acting authority." And I nodded, not as confirmation, but as acknowledgement of something that had always been true, something that had simply not been considered by the people who believed they could bypass it. And Ashley spoke then, her voice steady, but with an edge that had not been there before. "We have authorization," she said, and the man looked at her, not dismissively, but with a level of scrutiny that had not existed earlier. "Authorization from whom?" he asked, and that question, simple as it was, carried more weight than anything that had been said before, because it required a specific answer, not a general one, not a constructed one. And for the first time, Ashley hesitated, just for a moment, but long enough for the room to register it, long enough for the structure she had built to show its first visible crack, and she responded. "From Margaret," and I did not interrupt. I did not correct her immediately. I allowed the statement to exist, to settle in the room exactly as she presented it, because sometimes the most effective way to reveal the truth is to let the incorrect version of it be spoken first. And the man turned his attention back to me, his expression now clearly seeking confirmation. "Did you grant authorization for this transaction?" he asked, and I met his gaze calmly. "No," I said, and that single word did not echo. It did not need to. It simply replaced everything that had been assumed up to that point, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was filled with recalculation, with reassessment, with the quiet unraveling of something that had been presented as complete. And Ashley leaned forward slightly, her composure tightening. "You signed the documents," she said, and I turned my head toward her, not with confrontation, but with the same steady clarity I had maintained from the beginning. "I signed what I was told were preliminary forms while I was under medical care," I replied. "That is not the same as granting authority to transfer ownership under a trust." And the distinction was not loud, it was not aggressive, but it was precise, and precision, in a setting like this, carries more weight than any argument. And the man nodded slowly, already understanding the implications, already moving away from the assumption that this was a standard closing, and toward the recognition that it was something else entirely, something that required immediate reevaluation. "In that case," he said carefully, "we cannot proceed with this transaction as it stands." And Ashley's expression shifted again, not into panic, not into anger, but into something more controlled, more focused, as if she were searching for another angle, another way to maintain the outcome she had been so certain of. "There must be a way to resolve this," she said, and I watched her, not with judgment, but with clarity, because what she was experiencing was not confusion. It was the consequence of an assumption that had never been tested, and assumptions, once tested, either hold or fail, and hers was failing. And I spoke again, not to challenge her, not to escalate the situation, but to complete it, to bring it to the point where nothing remained uncertain. "There is a way to resolve it," I said, "by acknowledging that the property cannot be sold without my direct and informed consent under the terms of the trust." And the room settled into that statement, not as an argument, but as a conclusion. And the man nodded again, this time with finality. "That is correct," he said, and as he began to gather the documents, no longer as part of a closing, but as part of a halted process, I leaned back slightly in my chair, not in relief, not in victory, but in completion, because this moment, this exact moment, was what everything had been leading toward, not the exposure itself, but the undeniable clarity of it, the point where nothing needed to be explained further, where the structure of the truth stood on its own. And as I looked at Ashley, I did not see defeat, I saw understanding beginning to form, the slow recognition that what she had believed to be secure was never actually hers to control. And that realization, quiet as it was, changed everything, not just in that room, but in everything that would follow. No one spoke immediately after the man gathered the documents, and in that silence, something far more definitive than any argument settled into place, not just in the room, but in the space between all of us, because what had just been revealed was not a misunderstanding, not a technical delay, but a complete miscalculation. And I could see it in Ashley's eyes, not panic, not yet, but recognition, the slow, undeniable understanding that the outcome she had built her confidence around no longer existed in the form she believed it did. And Daniel shifted beside her, his posture no longer neutral, his hands no longer still, as if the weight of what had just unfolded was finally reaching him in a way it had not before. And I remained where I was, not because I needed to stay seated, but because there was no reason to move, no reason to rush. Everything that needed to happen had already begun. And it did not require force, it required time. And the man cleared his throat again, his voice now careful, precise. We will need to suspend this transaction until the ownership structure is fully reviewed and verified, he said, and Ashley nodded, but her nod was different from before. It was no longer an agreement, it was a response, a reaction to something she could not control, and she turned to me, her expression composed, but tighter now, more focused. We can resolve this, she said, and I met her gaze without hesitation, not with confrontation, but with clarity. It is already resolved, I replied, and the difference between those two statements was everything, because she was still thinking in terms of adjustment, of correction, of finding a way to preserve what she had attempted, while I was speaking from a place where the outcome had already been determined, not by emotion, not by opinion, but by structure, by something that existed independently of either of us. And she held my gaze for a moment longer, as if searching for something she could still use, some angle she had not yet considered, but there was nothing left to adjust. Nothing left to reinterpret, because the one detail she had missed was not small, it was foundational, and once that foundation was exposed, everything built on top of it lost its stability, and Daniel finally spoke, his voice quieter than I had ever heard it. Mom, he said, and I turned to him, not with expectation, not with disappointment, but with the same calm attention I had given everything else. And he hesitated, just long enough to show that whatever he had planned to say no longer fit the situation, and then he stopped, the words never fully forming, and in that moment, I understood something with complete certainty. This was not just about what had been done, it was about what had been assumed, and both of them had assumed that I would not see, that I would not question, that I would not act, and that assumption had carried them all the way to this room, to this table, to this exact moment where nothing could be hidden anymore, and I stood slowly, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the same measured control I had maintained from the beginning, and as I gathered my bag, I looked at the man across from us and said, "Thank you for your time," and he nodded, his expression respectful now, no longer procedural, because he understood that this was not a transaction he was managing, this was something else entirely, something that required a different kind of attention. And as I turned toward the door, Ashley spoke again, her voice steady, but carrying something new beneath it, something closer to urgency. "Margaret," she said, and I paused, not turning immediately, giving the moment just enough space to exist before I acknowledged it, and when I did turn, I met her eyes fully, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a calm that no longer needed to conceal anything, and she held my gaze, searching, calculating, trying to find a way back into a position she had already lost, and I could see it clearly now, not just what she had done, but how she had justified it to herself, how she had built a version of events where her actions made sense, where they were acceptable, even necessary. And I did not challenge that version directly, because it no longer mattered. What mattered was what had been revealed, and what could no longer be undone. And after a moment, I simply said, "You should have asked," and it was not an accusation, it was not even a question, it was a statement of fact, a recognition of the point where everything could have been different, and she did not respond, not immediately, because there was no response that could change what had already happened, and I turned again, walking toward the door with the same steady pace. Each step measured, each movement deliberate, and as I reached the hallway, the air felt different, not lighter, not heavier, just clearer, as if something that had been unresolved was now fully defined, and Daniel followed a few seconds later, his footsteps slower, uncertain, and when he caught up to me, he said my name again, softer this time, and I stopped, not because I needed to, but because I chose to, and I looked at him, really looked at him, not as the boy I had raised, not as the man he had become, but as someone standing at a point where his choices were finally visible, and he opened his mouth as if to explain, to justify, to say something that would make sense of everything, but he did not, and I did not ask him to, because explanations, at this stage, are not about truth, they are about comfort, and I was no longer interested in comfort, I was interested in clarity, and I said only one thing, quietly, without emphasis, "We will talk later." And then I continued walking, not looking back. Not because I was leaving something behind, but because what needed to be understood had already been revealed, and everything that followed would simply be a matter of how each of us chose to live with it.